Díomh go léir a cóide agus tá fáilte ród. Welcome to Be My Guest with me, Mary Honan, on Lear Media TV, supporting the Samaritans, Limerick and Tipperary. And my very special guest today is John Wood from the UK, who is the son of Major Leonard Burney, who was the first officer to liberate, one of the first anyway, to enter Bergen-Belsen, and he took charge of the camps after that, and then he was later promoted to Lieutenant Colonel before retiring. But Leonard wrote a book in later life called Liberating Belsen Concentration Camp, a personal account by Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Burney, and Liberating Bergen-Belsen, a personal account by Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Burney, a senior British officer who participated in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen camp. He went on to oversee the evacuation of ex-prisoners to the vast rehabilitation camp that the British Army set up, and was then appointed as the commandant of that camp until its management was handed over to the United Nations. He went on to give evidence against the SS guards at the Belsen war crimes trial. And this is the only book to be published that recounts the events that led up to the British Army's uncovering of the Nazi concentration camp and its 60,000 prisoners. It describes how the army dealt with the unprecedented horror that existed in the camp, how the surviving inmates were evacuated, and how the Royal Army Medical Corps established the world's largest ever hospital to care for the many thousands who were injured and dying. And before we start, John, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
I'm very, listen, I'm truly honored. My dad was in the Royal Army Medical Corps. When he was in the UK, he did his national service, but he was in the Royal Army Medical Corps and then John's Ambulance.
Oh, wonderful.
So tell me about your dad, John. What was it like growing up with Leonard?
Well, actually, my parents divorced when I was very young.
Yeah.
So he was only kind of at home. I think I was about 3 when they divorced. So I don't have that many memories of him being at home in a family setting, but I have more memories of him visiting me on Daddy Day, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Lunch from school and that type of thing. And then my mum remarried, and that's why I've changed my name to Wood, you see. To the name.
But she remarried into a very famous family, which would be the Kenwoods.
That's right. My stepfather is the founder of the Kenwood Food Company. That's right. And I changed my name to him to thank him for bringing me up as his own son. But that was a lovely gesture, John, on both your parts. You know. Yeah, he really appreciated that. He really did, and I explained it to Dad, and he understood as well. He wasn't upset about it. He understood my reasoning. Yeah. So that's the confusion of the wood burning thing. But yeah, anyway, in terms of the war and what Dad said as I was growing up, we didn't talk about it at all until suddenly one day, I think it was the 30th anniversary of the liberation, which would have been 75. He suddenly started telling me all about it, and I got very interested, and I realized that this was a really important part of history, and I've got this direct connection with it. And I ought to, sorry, I thought you disappeared then. And I have sort of a responsibility to tell the story. And as I got older, I got more and more interested. And then very near the end of his life, in fact, kind of like a year or 2 before, he said, rather than just have this story of mine about what happened at Belsen as an email, which is what it was originally, just an email he sent people, like in a Word document, all sort of cobbled together. He said, what about publishing it as an actual book? Would you help me do it? And I said, well, yeah, it's an amazing project. So we set about researching it all. My wife and I helped get it all together, find the photographs, get all the copyrights sorted out. My wife designed the cover, and
she did a great job. I'm a designer myself, and I designed my cover for my own book on the Holocaust, and I appreciate the huge deal it is to actually have to actually design a cover. It's not an easy job.
So much more goes into it than one realizes.
Oh gosh, yeah.
But 9 months later, we had it published just in time for the 70th anniversary of the liberation, which was the 15th of April, 2015.
And it he died in 2016. So
that's right, in March.
He lived to see it being published.
That's right. Yes, he was very happy that it was out there. His story is being told. A lot of media coverage, and so that's the story of how the book came to be. And I'm so pleased that he came up with that idea, because it's now properly recorded his story. But I mean, what I could do is I could go back and just sort of tell you where he came from, if you like.
That is. I'd love you to start at the very beginning, Leonard Burney, from the beginning.
Yeah, well, I've been doing a bit of digging in Ancestry. Got a little bit addicted. It's fantastic fun going into Ancestry.
It is.
What I've found out is that I've got it here in front of me. His paternal grandfather was born in Russia, and in 1867 came to live in Devon, and he was a dealer in gold jewelry. So that's the background. Then he married a local Devon girl. That would be my great grandmother. And then at some point the family moved to London, and then their son, in other words, my father's father, was born in London in 1891, and he helped run the family jewelry firm. And here's something interesting. At some point, they changed the name from Bernstein, which is what the family had been up to this point, to
I
Burney.
was wondering, was it a derivative of Bernstein or Bernstein?
I haven't found any documents, but I just know that the documents back in the 1800s were Bernstein, and all of a sudden it changes to Burney. I don't know who instigated.
Maybe they were trying to anglicize it.
Yeah, or hide the Jewishness in some way, maybe. I don't know. Worried about persecution or something.
But you say you had no idea of being Jewish growing up, and it's funny, John, how many of the people I've interviewed, including Dr. Helena Ganner, who wrote 4 letters to the witness of my childhood, she had no idea of her Jewishness. She was a Jew, but they were actually an atheist family, and they didn't believe at all. So when she was being persecuted for being Jewish, she didn't understand that. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can say though that Dad really was aware that he was born into a Jewish family. I mean, when he was at school, he went to a Christian public school, and of course, during Christian services and everything, he went into a different room with Muslims and other people that weren't Christian. So he's very aware of it. But he was committed atheist right from childhood.
Yeah,
he just he didn't think that God existed. It was just a material world. And of course, his views were reinforced by Belsen.
Yeah.
We got onto yet, but when he saw those dead bodies and that God allowed this to happen, it reinforced his view that God couldn't possibly exist if this is allowed to happen. So that's a big debatable subject, of course, but that's what he felt.
Yeah, and who could blame him?
Well, yes, but I've met other people for who that experience reinforced their religious belief, and they became priests.
Yeah, well, this is it. People have had complete conversions, and people have found that through a lot of people found that the one thing that they had to hold on to was hope and faith, not necessarily faith in a God, but faith that things were going to come right at the end of it. And as long as you have faith and you have hope, that hope that will drives you forward. And in a lot of respects, it actually strengthened people's faith.
Yeah, so it affects people differently. Yeah. Anyway, he was always atheist. I even had chats with him about religion and so on, but he wasn't having any of it. No spiritual, physical things, DNA and everything. But that's his view. So fine. So anyway, going back to his life, then yes, became Burns. His dad became Bernstein somewhere through in the middle of his life at some point. And then he married in 1917 my grandmother, Mari, and she came over from Russia. She was born in Russia, Poland, which I think, according to her birth certificate, was the bound, like in between Russia and Poland. It changed a lot through the years, but somewhere around there. And to escape the pogrom that was going on there.
Yeah.
Because as a baby, 1900, age 0, her family fled and came to London. So that's an interesting repeating of the story of being persecuted for being Jewish. And he uncovers Belsen. So that's an interesting, almost harmonic of what happened. Yeah. Anyway, so there we are living in London now. And then Mari and Alexander marry. And Dad was born in 1920 in London. So he's a real Londoner. And his name was Adolf, can you believe? He was actually Christian Adolf.
Oh my God.
Adolf Leonard. And it was named after a big movie star of the time called Adolphe Menjou, who was an American movie star in the silent era as well as the talk.
I bet he swiftly changed that.
Yes. His mum thought the actor was very handsome and so named her son after him. But of course, 1920, Adolf wasn't a problem.
No.
Later, but
I don't think there's anyone has ever been called the name since. Isn't it remarkable?
But before, it was just an ordinary name, of course.
Yeah.
He's never used it. He's always been Leonard, although his initials are AL. So it's Major A.L. Burney you see in the documents and stuff.
Yeah.
And he was an only child. And
are you an only child, John?
I have 2 brothers. One's sadly passed away. I have 1 brother. But I'm
an only child.
Okay.
My mother was an only child, so.
It's running in the family.
Yeah.
But my dad's father was in the jewelry business, and his mother ran dress shops.
That's
ladies'
right.
dress shops.
Yeah.
So they weren't poor, and Dad was brought up basically by his nanny.
As you would.
Yeah, that's the way it was. I don't think he saw his mum much. He was kind of with his nanny most of the time. And then his first school was called the Hall School in St. John's Wood. Okay. Now, it's really interesting that I mentioned that because in his story, he wrote a whole story of his life for his grandchildren, documented his basically a whole autobiography. And he mentions this school. He couldn't remember the name, but he mentions the cap had a Maltese cross on it. I think it was in St. John's Wood. So my wife and I did some digging and found out that there's only one school it could possibly be, Hall School, which is still going today.
Wow.
And jump forward a little bit. He was in, I'm coming to this later, of course, but Dad was in some very important documentaries, Holocaust documentaries, one of which is called No Asylum.
Asylum, yes.
And Frank.
Yeah.
And so I was encouraged by the filmmakers to get screenings of this film in schools or anywhere that anyone interested for the sake of Holocaust education. And I managed to book a screening at Hall School, having discovered that Dad went there. And I took Anne Frank's stepsister along with me, who did a little talk, Q&A about it. So that was quite something to go to the school that Dad was there. He was there in something like 1926 or something. And it was a very successful event, and the kids asked very intelligent questions, and that was wonderful. So he went there. Then
it's great when the children are informed. I find here in Ireland, our education system is very good in that respect, because history is always taught in secondary school, and in tertiary education, people take it on obviously as a 3rd level subject, but they're always taught, at least in some level, about the Holocaust. But I still think it should be something that should be taught in every school at some level, because I looked at literature and I looked at comics and fairy tales and allegories and time travel novels. All of these can be introduced to children at a very young level to even introduce the subject of otherness and the subject of difference, or breaking down barriers or turning a blind eye when someone has been persecuted, even if it's the child just being bullied in school.
Well, I was just going to say that. What I love about Holocaust education, it even stops bullying.
This is it. You know, you can approach it on a level they understand, and gradually they'll grow to understand that book actually means more than just, say, fighting in school or not getting on with your friends in school. This is what it means as they grow.
Yeah,
and I do think it should be taught in every school.
Absolutely, and it's lacking in some schools, in some countries, and so on. And that's something I'm wanting to campaign to change.
It's very bad in America.
Yeah. Well, then Steve went to my dad went to St. Paul's, which is the next school, which was in Hammersmith at the time. And he did really well. He's a very intelligent man, and he was all set for Cambridge.
Yeah.
But he was born in 1920.
Yeah.
And the war was just brewing when he left school.
And that ended his chances of Cambridge.
He never went there. He was very upset about that because he would have really done well. Anyway, so he joined, knowing that the war was coming, and pretty obvious at the time. He joined the territorial army and became an officer.
Yeah.
And some funny stories, actually. You know, the reality of war and the harshness hadn't quite hit, even though he'd done all this training and he was watching the news and could see that Hitler was doing what he was doing. But for him, he loved the territory, all the drilling and training. But most important, there were these weekend dances, you see, where he would be wearing his uniform, look really, really smart, his uniform. And the girls were there and they would love him in his uniform and so on. And
so he was hooked on the uniform.
And so were the girls.
Well, you know, I mean, it is a very important subject, really, about the power of the uniform. I mean, it was the same with when you look at the Nazis. You know, you had these people who were, many of them uneducated, many of them highly educated, but many of them uneducated, and give them a uniform and a sense of power, and suddenly they think they're omnipotent and they become omnipotent.
That's right. But Dad loved the fact he, you know, looked all smart and the girls all swooned over him. So he loved that whole thing. And it was all a bit unreal at the time. And all of a sudden, one day, a brown envelope came through his door. And it said, the letter inside said, "You are called up for active duty." And all of a sudden, things got very real. You know, it kind of hit him that now this was real. And he joined the Royal Artillery in the anti-aircraft unit. And that's the beginning of 1940. And he was posted as duty officer in the control centre of London's anti-aircraft defences. And that's just like you see in the movies, is that large map with the girls with the sort of broomsticks, you know, pushing airplanes around. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just like we've seen in the movies and the documentaries. And so that's where he was working. And he says that at first, you know, the phony war, nothing happened for ages. No bombs, Hitler didn't do anything. And everyone thought it was sort of nothing going to happen. Anyway, he was stationed at the Isle of Dogs. And he was in charge of lots of anti-aircraft units. And shooting down the bombers and so on as they were flying over London. But then because he did so well and because the Battle of Britain was so successful and all the heavy anti-aircraft fire, Hitler eventually gave up invading Britain in the autumn of 1940.
That's right. Yeah.
So now Dad often said to me, people only talk to me about Belsen. What about all the other things I did? He almost got irritated by the fact that he wanted to talk about other things, but no one was really interested in that. But you know, his anti-aircraft is quite.
I would have listened to him.
Oh, I'm sure, but it's quite a story actually. And then in 1942, he was promoted to rank of captain, and he became an instructor at the Regimental Gunnery School, training anti-aircraft personnel. And then in his 24th birthday, 1944, he was promoted to the rank of major. And you couldn't be a major younger than 24. So he must have been one of the youngest majors in the army at the time. obviously. So then now, at this point now, preparations for invading Europe, to take back Europe, were now underway. And Dad was appointed instructor to train anti-aircraft units, not just to shoot down planes, but how to move.
Yeah.
You know, you get positioned in one place, then you're advancing, so you have to pick up everything and move to another position, tie it all down, and then start shooting again. And that was a whole training session. And because now everyone's about to be moving through Europe, they really need to know how to do this. So Dad was training the troops how to do that. And then where he did it was in Wales, I never heard of this place before, Kinmel Park Camp in North Wales.
Yeah.
Where over a 4 to 5 month period, he trained over 3,600 men, 6 different regiments, 600 people in each regiment. So that's quite an achievement, isn't it?
For a 24-year-old, it was huge. I mean, when you think of 24-year-olds now, they're still in college, probably going to college for the first time, because they actually, youngsters seem to stay in college forever now, do you know?
Yeah.
And your dad was, when you think about it, your dad was out there seeing the worst of humanity.
Well, he hadn't quite got there. He certainly did.
But he was heading heading into it. And you know, when people say things like, oh, Dad, you wouldn't understand, or Grandpa, you wouldn't understand, my God, you know, when you look at our lives and people's lives younger than us, you think to yourself, God, they don't know what hardship really is.
Well, they said that people born in the 20s, that was the tough generation.
Yeah.
They really knew how to survive and to deal with life's problems.
You know, and
anyway, I mean, I couldn't do that now. I mean, training 3,600 people and have the authority and command and everything.
Have to make such decisions. I mean, life and death decisions.
Yeah, and he's training these people. It's really important to train them properly so that
I was struck by, when I was researching your dad, I was struck by the fact that he said, you know, one sentence, "We kill them with kindness," really struck with me. About how trying to feed people who had been starved for so long. You think, oh, we'll just feed you, but their stomachs had closed so badly that, and the food was so rich for them that it actually killed them.
And then they have to live with on their conscience as well.
The guilt,
you know, of all the horror.
You know, you're not given a guidebook going in to something that the world has never experienced before.
It's just instinct. You want to feed these poor starving people.
You know, and we'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll definitely get there. So just the next step then is so then now we're about 1944, and Dad, so we'd already invaded Europe, and Dad wasn't with the original troops going over, but it had all been done. And then later on, Dad was sent over to France, to Le Havre actually, and to join the troops there and to bring the anti-aircraft units with him and set those up, because the troops were still being attacked by bombers and low-flying airplanes, you know, shooting at them and so on. So that was Dad's role, to set all that up. But by the spring of 1945, the Germans had run out of planes and fuel, and so there was actually nothing for Dad to do. There was no one to shoot at anymore. So Dad was just going along with the rest of the troops. And then on the 12th of April,
John, the way you said it, there was no one to shoot at anymore. It's like, oh God, we've got no one to shoot at. Let's move on.
That's what the way Dad told me. Then he comes across Belsen. Belsen's now about to happen in the story. And they basically said to him, well, Bernie, you've got nothing to do now. Why don't you go and sort out this camp thing, whatever it is, and take over and look after it and be in charge.
Little knowing
why, you see, because he was a bit redundant at this point. So on the 12th, now here's a really fascinating story. You know, because I've done research, but it still is a fascinating, unprecedented event in the whole of World War II, as far as I can tell in my research.
Yeah.
Where the day after his 25th birthday, the 12th of April, suddenly some German officers waved a white flag and said, please, can we talk? And there was an actual truce ceasefire, and it was all agreed, rather than just taking it or shooting around the camp and opening the doors and letting these diseased people come out and disease everybody. Germans recommended that we didn't do that, and we just agreed a no-fire zone all around the camp, and then take over the camp in an orderly fashion, and then carry on the rest of the troops to win the war towards Berlin. And Dad was told to go and sort all this out. So this ceasefire was agreed, and then on the 15th of April, they reached Belsen finally, and Dad was told to take a jeep and a driver, and with his senior officer, take charge of the camp and report back with his eyewitness account of the situation he found in the camp.
Yeah.
So he had to drive down this road lined with German soldiers either side. I mean, can you imagine, is it a trap? I mean, they could have killed them, but nobody did. But he was a little bit worried about that. But then he made it to the front gate. And the weird thing is that this jeep was met by Joseph Kramer, the commandant of the whole camp, and about 30 armed SS guards, some of them were women, and they were on parade, and they were going to do a handover, as if they sort of had a weird delusion that sort of, that we're going to take over the camp and run it as a camp.
And one of those women actually transpired, one of those Nazi officers transpired, it was Hilda Michnier Lisievich, and Tommy Reichenthal remembers her vividly because she was one of the camp guards that he remembers stamping on the necks of three young men because they tried to steal an extra slice of extra piece of bread, and he went to meet her years later when she was in her 90s, and she pulled out at the last minute and said she didn't want to meet him.
I know, his documentary is amazing. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I have. Tommy's a friend of mine.
Yeah, I've met him too. What a lovely man he is.
Absolute gentleman, and such that he was willing to actually reconcile, if you can possibly, for his own suffering, not for anyone else's, but to meet her and ask her, did she feel remorse? But of course the woman was remorseless. These people are so remorseless that I don't think, there's very few of them will actually admit to their guilt or remorse for what they did.
Yeah, but he wouldn't have been nasty and been.
No, he wouldn't.
Would he?
No.
He just tried to understand and be friendly.
That's all he wanted. I don't think you can understand. I don't think the victims can even understand what was done to them. I don't think even the perpetrators can understand really why they were so evil.
It's a fascinating story, how they got hypnotized or something, whatever it is. Fascinating.
Do I mean, you can argue that they were evil or that they were mad, but there is a quote that that I read before that said, with the exception of a few, most were ordinary men, and more dangerous are the functionaries ready to do the will of somebody in charge without question. They're much more dangerous. It's giving them a kind of a passover by saying, oh, they were mad. They certainly weren't mad.
It is as if they got
ordinary men and women who did evil things.
But it's like they got taken over by, almost hypnotized, isn't it?
It's just you just don't understand at what point humanity can actually leave your system, because if you even stood on the dog's paw by mistake, something inside you would die.
Yeah,
certainly does with me. That's how they could abdicate all sense of humanity.
I know, beggars belief, but it happened, and it could happen again.
Oh, it can absolutely happen again.
It has happened again.
And people who think Martin Niemöller's quote, first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist, and then eventually they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. we can sit back in our cozy 21st century and think, oh, that happened 75 years ago, 70, that's not going to happen today. But of course, it will happen again. But it might be it mightn't be the Jew the next time. It could be the Christian, it could be the Muslim, it could be anyone.
Well, it's already happened in Bosnia. It already happened in Indonesia in 1965.
Yeah. And, we have to stand up. We have to speak out when we see these things happening to someone else.
Yeah, well, that's what Dad wanted to do. That's why he wrote the book, and also to combat Holocaust deniers. That really irritated him.
Just don't understand. I just really don't. I just think that perhaps it's in people who deny that they're so fearful of believing that one human being can do that to another. So therefore, it's in every one of us to be a victim, but it's also in every one of us to be a perpetrator.
Oh, yeah.
Given the right set of or the wrong set of circumstances.
But education is the way.
Education,
out, I think. The more education.
And empathy.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he arrived at Bergen-Belsen.
Yeah. So where did I get to? Yeah, so he had to go back and give his eyewitness account back to his senior officer several miles back and report what he saw. The camp was handed over by Kramer, and Dad went in a Jeep and toured the camp. This was, as far as I can tell, this first in, everyone sort of claims to be the first in. And as far as I can tell, Dad was probably in the very first Jeep doing the reconnaissance tour of the whole place with Colonel Taylor, his senior officer, and with the loudspeaker person speaking in German with a loud hailer on top of the Jeep, announcing that the camp was now run by the British and you're safe.
Yeah.
And Kramer himself was in the same Jeep as Dad told me.
God.
I know.
I actually saw that in the video that I'll be showing in a few minutes of the documentary.
Oh, yeah.
You can see Kramer getting into the Jeep.
Right. So they toured the camp, and then at least the people knew that they were safe and it was now liberated. And then this is what Dad said in his biography on seeing what he saw as he drove around. I remember being completely shattered. The dead bodies laying beside the road, the starving, emaciated prisoners, both men and women, still mostly behind barbed wire, the open mass graves containing hundreds of corpses, the stench, the sheer horror of the place were indescribable. None of us who entered the camp had any inkling of what we were about to see or had ever experienced anything remotely like it before. Quite a shock and a trauma for everybody involved.
Can I ask you, John, did at this point, your dad would have known that, okay, yes, 6 million Jews died in the Shoah.
Yeah.
11 million people altogether, including 5 million Gentiles. Did your father at this stage have any sense of his Jewishness when he was confronted with the horrors of what was happening to people purely because not that they were Jewish, but that they believed, or that they were Jewish by faith, if you like, because many of them were non-believers, but that they were Jewish by ethnicity, which really, I found out my great-grandmother was, there was Jewish blood, and Jacob was the surname. But according to the 1939 Nuremberg laws, I would have been defined as a Mischling second degree, which was just, I had Jewish blood. So therefore I would have been, their law, everything was insane. I mean, if you were blind and you were Jewish, you weren't allowed to use a white cane crossing the road. I mean, it was just, and you think 70 years later, it's not long enough for people to simply want to just wash it away. You know, these things. Did your dad feel any sense of suddenly being connecting with his Jewishness, if you like, with his Jewish ethnicity?
I don't think so at all, actually, personally. By the way, it wasn't just Jews. It was
no, it wasn't. It was
homosexuals and political prisoners and all sorts.
The disabled.
Yeah, but majority was Jewish. But no, I don't. I just think he saw them as poor people who'd been persecuted and were in a terrible situation and were dying. And he just wanted to. I don't think he even thought about the Jewishness of it at all. Personally, I've never had any evidence of it. And he just wanted to save as many lives as he could. I mean, he found 60,000 prisoners when he got there, and 13,000 dead bodies all over the place. And
walking into hell.
He walked into hell. 500 were dying every day. There was no food, no water, and no sanitation. And the place was so overcrowded, 10 times as many people were there than it was designed to hold. So he had quite an emergency, humanitarian emergency on his hands without any warning. And the German soldiers just said, you know, when he had that truce meeting, there's a bit of disease in there, kind of thing.
Flippant.
Yeah, they didn't sort of explain the enormity of the problem. So,
but Tommy said that, you know, and I called the first interview I did of Tommy, he played among the corpses. He said it was just such, and one of the photographs that I saw of a child just running down and walking piles and piles of corpses. It was exactly as Tommy described. They played among the corpses.
That's right.
Midden piles of corpses that were there, and it was just second nature.
I know, just so horrific.
One couldn't imagine
the enormity. I mean, 60,000 people. That's quite a big town.
Yeah,
it's just so huge. It's difficult to comprehend, really. They're just numbers to us, but you know, and the smell of the place, and the death everywhere, just and it affects people so badly. Some people couldn't ever talk about it till their grave. It was so upsetting. Dad managed to, even though he was there for such a long time, somehow he snapped out of it and he managed to lead a normal life and was very successful. Anyway, what happened straight after the tour, and they realized, you know, what they just witnessed was war crimes. The senior officer, Colonel Taylor, asked or ordered that the SS all be arrested and put them under guard straight away. And then the emergency had to be handled, water, food, and everything. So Dad was given the task of getting the water supply going because the water had packed up. So he enlisted the help of the fire brigade of the nearby town, Cell, C-E-L-L-E.
Yeah.
And what with water pumps and whatever, they got it all going again. And then the next thing, the same day, food. Later on in the day, find food. Which is kind of orders. See, so we just drove around and found just a mile or two up the road this huge, absolutely enormous German barracks.
Yeah.
Huge buildings.
And it's full of food.
The German army left it just a few days before, and it was full. It was enormous to house thousands. And there was a bakery still staffed and huge stores of food that could easily have been.
Can you imagine the smell wafting? You know, I was looking at it and I suppose you're there thinking just a mile down the road, basically, from people being systematically starved. And the smell that must have been hovering over the camps and the people knowing that they're, you know, I'm never going to get food again, do you know? I mean, the inhumanity of it just beggars belief.
I know, but I think if anybody complained about it or did anything about it, the locals, this is often discussed, did the locals know? But I think if they had, they would probably put in there themselves. There's a certain point where you can complain about a dictatorship. But once it's gone past the tipping point, if you complain, you get shot. So
there's a priest actually in Father Dubois. I don't know if you know of him, but he is the most extraordinary priest. I'm trying to get in contact with him and trying to get an interview with him. He has done a documentary called The Holocaust by Bullets. and he has gone to Eastern Europe to try and find the bodies, the mass graves of the unknown Jews that were massacred. And people have described where, as children, they were sitting up trees watching what was happening, and they were crying hysterically. These are 80 and 85-year-old people who were actually given binoculars by the Nazis to actually watch as they brought men, women, and children and shot them into the graves, and how they, you know, how they talk about the graves moving afterwards, that they knew there were people still alive inside it. You're never going to get over things like that. But Father Dubois is in France, and he has an organization called Unum in Anum, and it's half Hebrew and half Latin. And it's his mission he's gone all around the world talking about it, to try and find all the mass graves that will make it much more than 6 million or 11 million. It could be double, treble that if you were to actually find all the people that were killed and buried in mass graves.
Fascinating project.
Yeah, it's a fascinating. He has a great few documentaries are on YouTube, but
I'll look out for it. Thank you.
Yeah, but your dad anyway was.
Yeah, so he found the food. He reported back that there is this huge food supply there, unused, clean, ready and waiting to feed thousands of people. So the obvious decision was made to basically empty the camp and move all the prisoners into this beautiful new place, which was turned into a hospital, because many thousands need to be hospitalized, but not all of them. Some of them were well enough and they didn't need to go to hospital. And Dad was actually put in charge of them to get them out of the camp, the 20,000+ odd out of the camp and into the camp, the new camp, waiting to be repatriated. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. Yeah, you mentioned about 1,000 or more prisoners died, because when the British went in, they wanted to feed them, and they gave them, they cooked these lovely rich stews, and it killed them, which is so sad. But they were just trying to help. But it didn't.
Yeah, it did actually strike with me, your dad's comment, we killed them with kindness.
Yeah, which is really, really awful. But that's, what can you do?
Actually, Zoltan's in Collis now. He was 4 when he was released from Bergen-Belsen, and Dr. Bob Collis, who founded the Cerebral Palsy Clinic here in Ireland, he went to, and he liberated. He was one of the medical liberators, and he adopted Zoltan and his sister Edith. And Zoltan had TB of the spine, so he was very, very bad, and he managed to get them into Ireland, because Ireland was a closed shop for Jewish children. We refused 500 Jewish children, but we hid known Nazis in this country. And he convinced the Irish government to let these children in. And Zoltan came in, and he was treated in Ireland for the TB. And Alexander Fleming was the first child in Ireland to have penicillin tested on. But that's just another kind of a story out of Belsen.
Oh, there's so many.
4-year-old.
So many stories connected to Belsen.
He died 8 years ago, and his sister Edith died a week later.
Oh.
Yeah, so. It's
so many stories.
Very sad story.
Fascinating and extremely sad.
I was fortunate to get to interview him, though, and he was a lovely little man. Not a bit politically correct, you know. Not a bit.
I love it.
It was just not a bit. A lovely little man, but he carried the disability all his life, you know, and you know, and he also carried the trauma.
Of course, as did everybody, to a greater or lesser degree.
The showers, he hated the shower. He hated the word schnell, heraus.
Yeah.
Anyone, if he heard that, or the planes flying over fast, terrified him.
Reminders, aren't they?
All triggers.
Of course. Well, so Dad was given the job of organising the transfer of the prisoners who didn't need to be hospitalised to the transit camp, as it was called. In other words, the transit between being repatriated and the dirty disease camp in between. And the same area had the displaced persons camp. It was different names. Anyway, so the actual procedure, he explains, is that they had showers, which the British Army rigged up, the shower unit. I mean, they hadn't washed for years in some cases. Then they were deloused with DDT because, of course, typhus, which was the disease that was dominant in the camp, spread by lice. So they had to kill the insects with DDT, the insecticide, white powder. So pictures of them all covered in white powder. And Dad says that he was covered in white powder every morning. That was part of the routine. Then they were loaded into lorries, lorry by lorry, all these prisoners, these cleaned, deloused prisoners. And Dad and a handful of soldiers worked 12 to 14 hours a day. And they managed to transfer over 1,000 prisoners every day. And it took over 3 weeks to get everybody in. These are ones that are well, the ill ones were taken on a separate route to the hospital, but these are the ones that could walk. That was the definition. If they're well enough to walk, they're okay. Didn't need to go to hospital. And there's over 20,000 prisoners. And that was his little project he had to execute. Something I noticed when I was reading his book is that he said that almost all of the British troops working there contracted dysentery, because that was another disease that everybody had there, but they just kept on working.
Sure, of course.
You must have felt awful, have to go to the toilet all the time, but you had to keep working. What dedication.
But you know what, it must have been absolutely awful as well. And I know he found it shocking, or he found a great sympathy for the soldiers that had to actually shovel basically the bodies into graves because they were falling apart as they tried to, as the Nazis were trying to pull them into, literally they were falling apart.
Well, the British made the Germans dump all the, great idea.
It was a phenomenal idea. It's not good enough for them, but the fact is that many of the bodies couldn't be dragged in because they were gone so decomposed that the British soldiers had to basically bulldoze many of the bodies in, and that must have been awful for those soldiers.
Oh yeah, just horrendous. The stench, the experience, the memory of it. I've met on Twitter, I've actually met the sons or grandsons of some of those bulldozer drivers. That's what I love about Twitter. You can make connections. You can't make.
Your dad was very, very taken with that and very sympathetic towards them.
Yeah, because it's a horrific job. But the horrible part of actually getting the bodies in was the Germans did that. So that's a wonderful thing, way of solving that problem.
They're coming for you, John.
Yeah. So the next step is that Dad was then made camp commandant, which is a German word, but he was in charge of the transit, that camp where the well people were waiting to be repatriated.
Kramer had been the commandant of the camp.
The actual concentration camp, commandant of the transit camp, the nice clean place where people and then in May 1945, the actual concentration camp was all burnt down because it was so disease-ridden. I
always think that was a pity that they had to burn it down, because I just think it should have stood as a reminder of what hell looks like.
Yeah,
people, but one can understand how everything had to be burnt because it was just disease infected.
Yes, too bad. It was too bad to be kept, too dangerous. But other camps that remain, like Dachau and so on. So it's something. There are so many stories. There's so many stories connected, like the story about Nanette Blitz-Koenig.
Yeah, that is just so fabulous. That story is just amazing.
Yeah, and that was Anne Frank's classmate. They were at school in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And Nanette is mentioned in the diary it just says, Nanette gave me a brooch for my 13th birthday. And they were both in Belsen together. And sadly, Anne Frank, as everyone knows, died just before the British arrived.
Just about a week before the British arrived.
Yeah, that's right.
And her sister Margot, who largely is forgotten in many respects, because
her name is mentioned on the gravestone.
That's right, yeah.
So Nanette came up to Dad shortly after the British arrived and asked if he would write to her aunt in London, because all of Nanette's family had been murdered in various camps, and she, as far as she knew, was the only surviving member. So apart from her aunt, who was safe in London, the two aunts.
I'd love to meet them.
She's in her early 90s, and she lives in São Paulo now.
São Paulo.
And so Dad was shocked and wrote the letter to the aunt in London, and that letter can be seen. I've got a copy of it. It's online in Dad's handwriting, so it's quite an important historical document now.
It'd be nice to, if you can send me a copy of it, I'll include it in this.
Sure. And then Nanette helped translate various things for Dad, because she was quite a polyglot, and so they got to know each other quite well. And Dad is mentioned in Nanette's book, and Nanette has written one of the prefaces, forwards rather, in Dad's book. So,
tell me the story about the wedding at the wedding at Bergen-Belsen, because this, for any woman out there, is just, for anyone who's a romantic at heart, it's a wonderful story of two people meeting in that horror and beauty being created. Because Peter Ginz died in Auschwitz, but he was in Theresienstadt, and he was an artist, a poet, a writer, everything. And he talked about how even in modern scum, beauty can be created.
Yeah.
And how, almost like in the most arable of lands, you can have this beautiful flower growing. Here you were in the depths of hell, and yet two people could, from different faiths, different ethnicities, could come together and find love and get married. And the dress we have to talk about as well, but go on.
Yes, it's amazing. Well, that is the other story I was going to tell, actually. Norman Turgle was one of the British intelligence officers who was sent to Belsen to deal with the SS there. And while he's there, he met this young girl who, I think she described herself as a nurse, called Gina, Gena, and she was the prisoner there, and they just met, and Norman decided there and then that he's going to marry her. And when you hear Gina talking about it, she said, it doesn't matter what I wanted, that's what Norman had decided. So
we're going to get married, and that's it.
That's right. And then because Dad was in charge of that particular part of the camp.
Was Norman Jewish as well?
Yeah.
I misunderstood that. I thought they were.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so he had to ask Dad for permission to hold an engagement party at the camp, not the disease camp, the new camp, the clean new camp. And Dad gave permission, and this party was held, and Gina didn't know anything about it. She said, oh, what's going on? Who's having a party? And Norman said, it's for you, it's for us, we're getting engaged. This is our engagement party. Oh, really?
Started, you mean to continue, Norman?
Yeah, exactly. And they got married, and there's loads of great-grandchildren in London and probably other parts of the world too from that marriage, which is very heartwarming.
But the dress was the dress was another spectacular. And it's funny, when I was researching this, I discovered that quite a number of people afterwards got married in parachute silk.
Yes.
Which as a designer, I think this is just fabulous, that the idea that they actually would have put together, the soldiers or whoever just would have put together this dress for her, or the inmates would have put together this dress for her out of the silk that made the parachutes.
Yeah, and now it's so important, it's in the Imperial War Museum.
It is, that's right. Yeah, I had heard about this story before I spoke to you, so I did some more research, but it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, the simplicity of Gina on that day, you know, defies any, you know, I mean, even by today's standards, it's just simply beautiful. That's a lovely photograph of Gina with you.
Yeah, she was a remarkable woman. When you heard her speak, she said such wonderful things, so true, made you think. And also, above all, it was don't discriminate, don't be prejudiced, don't hate. And coming from a Nelson survivor, you listen.
But Anne Frank's friend, she owes a lot to your dad as well, doesn't she?
Well, she said that he helped save her life in there because even though they were liberated, that some of them were so ill, so malnourished and so diseased. Many died after liberation. Thousands died after liberation. And so Nanette says that because of Dad, the help that he gave her, he helped her survive. So there's a very special bond that I have now with Nanette's family. They contacted me out of the blue. They found me on Facebook because Nanette used to, I don't know if she still does, but give lectures in schools. And she always mentioned this British officer.
Yeah.
One day somebody said, let's see if this officer is around and I can find him. And then that's how it all started.
But you know, there's a photograph that I actually want to share with you now here. Mm-hmm. And every time I see this photograph, it sends chills. Because I don't know if you see the similarity, but the little girl in the front with big smiling face always reminds me of Anne Frank.
Well, it could be.
And it's it's not because she died. That was as the little soldiers were arriving.
That's right.
But you know, and she walks straight to the front and commands almost you looking at her with this big smile. And when you see it in the video, you can't help but think for a second, oh my God, it's Anne Frank. Yeah. You know, and but it always it stops me in my tracks when I see it. But tell us about the documentary that was done. When I think it's an extraordinary documentary that was done in the medium they used, which was Twitter.
Oh yeah. So I was contacted. I get contacted all the time. It's wonderful, helping get Dad's story out there. And
I just before we start, I just want to show you. I just want to show you that that's actually Hilda Milisiewicz, and she was the camp guard that Tommy Reichenthal remembers from the camp, and she used to bring her daughter, her children, every year to Bergen-Belsen Museum to have a look at the photos. And just as she'd come to her own photo, she'd pull them away. And it was almost like she wanted them to see that her involvement, but still didn't want to at the end. And she gave a talk to the Bergen-Belsen Museum archives, but she would never speak to Tommy.
Oh,
you know, and she, you know, it's just so it was a great sadness for him. And
oh yeah.
He won't. I'm sure there was a sense of anger as well that he went the whole way over, thinking that she would actually speak to him.
Oh, it would have been an incredible meeting.
You know,
it wasn't to be.
But you were telling us about the Twitter.
Yeah, so I get contacted by people all the time doing research or whatever, like yourself.
Yeah.
To do something about Dad or Belsen or whatever. And one person was this filmmaker. Who one had come up with a brilliant idea of turning historical events into tweets, as if Twitter existed in the past, and the story was being told by the soldier right there with tweets, which is such a brilliant idea. I love it because it makes it real for young people today.
We're going to try and show a little bit of it if I can.
Yeah.
1 second now, if I see if I can actually show it. Share.
I mean, it's 14 minutes or it's longer than that, I think.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll actually put it to the end of this documentary, of this video, and people can watch it. But it's a remarkable, simple and absolutely breathtaking in its simplicity, really. And, you know, the fact that you could almost think that Leonard Burney was tweeting from Bergen-Belsen.
It's done so well, as if he's taking these shots, these videos on his own phone, which of course he didn't have. But the thing that makes it real, that's most important, is that the tweets aren't made up by the filmmaker. They're actually Dad's own words
from his book,
fashioned into tweets, taken from his book, taken from emails I sent the filmmaker, taken from his own life story, and turned into tweets. So that's what makes it more believable.
Yeah.
And hopefully will make a big impact on kids that see it. That's my purpose anyway. So yeah, it's Leonard Bernard's story. And
it is a way of bringing it, I suppose, into the 21st century, because we live in an era right now where it's almost everything is immediate.
That's right.
And people don't want to, you know, you see all these tweets and everything like that. People have just seem to have very short attention spans.
That's right.
And they look at a few lines and that's it. They want to move on. And unless it actually clicks with them within 2 seconds, they don't seem to want to. I mean, I don't want to do a disservice to youth, because there's some, you know, youth can be absolutely phenomenal and that, but they do tend to like things that are short and swift and impactful. And I think that when people see at the end of this video, the 15-minute documentary, they'll be astounded by it. And it's not really a documentary, as you say, it's a series of tweets with videos.
Yeah, that's what it is. And why not adapt the story to that format if that's the way that people will understand it?
Yeah.
Exactly what he did. And it's great they're going to play it after this.
Yeah. No, I will. I'll absolutely put it to this. But when he came home from Bergen-Belsen, he never spoke about it after that.
No. But I just want to say the other thing before I answer that question is that it's personal as well. It's another reason it works, because it's Dad expressing what his reaction to what he saw and how he felt.
Yeah.
It's very real that it's an individual.
So good. I mean, you know, when people see it, they should be very conscious, when I put it at the end, of the detail. Leonard's photograph on the Twitter account, and the amount every few seconds going from 1.5 million people viewing to 1.6 million people viewing to 1.7.
Going viral,
Going viral.
It should be on TV. It really should be on TV. It should be broadcast on TV.
Of course it should. And I mean, I hope that with our shows that they're aimed at an international audience. So one would hope, and I share them on all the Holocaust pages. And do you know what I was interested in as well, was the fact that he was discouraged from allowing the Jewish victims to actually get into Israel.
Yes.
Former Palestine, but he couldn't see it in himself to actually do that, because it was prior to 1948, and he wouldn't allow that to happen. So he eased their transport so that they could. That was extraordinary.
Well, I mean, I could tell that story now, or there's a few other little things I wanted to say. Can I lead up to that and make that the sort of punchline?
Absolutely.
Well,
sorry, I ruined your punchline.
No, that's all right. A few things I've just prepared, and I just thought you'd like to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we'll get there. But wonderful. So what it is so now all the horror had finished, and it was a matter of rehabilitating everybody, getting them to be sent home, getting them well, so they can go back and lead normal lives again. So now they're in this camp. Some of them have gone home already, because if they were taken from France or other Western countries, it was a very simple matter of just going home, either immediately or once they were well. The problem was with the people from the Eastern countries that had now was now part of Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Or their home or village wasn't there anymore. It had been blown up. So they didn't want to go home.
No.
That was a shock to the British. They thought, well, obviously people want to go home, but actually they refused. So they're stuck with nowhere to go. And there was 20-odd thousand people just wouldn't go. And as you were saying earlier, Ireland turned its back on taking in refugees from having given.
So did mostly every country during the Evian Conference in 1938 to decide the Jewish question. Every country refused to take, and only for, I suppose, the Quakers would have been phenomenal for setting up the Kindertransport and for other humanitarian works. Many of the people who survived would not have survived.
No, but Dad was really irritated by all these governments who all around the world turned their back on these poor people who just had a horrific experience. Now they have nowhere to live. So they were, so jumping forward to the punchline now, which I'll say and then I come back. He was actually had orders to stop people leaving. Now the awkward thing is that Belsen, the new camp, wasn't a prison camp. I mean, they weren't actually held there against their will. They could leave if they wanted to, but the British were supposed to keep them there until they had proper visas.
You have to say that was post the British arriving, that they could leave whenever they wanted.
Yeah, that's right, after liberation.
Yeah.
But Dad was supposed to keep them there, but he disagreed with what he was told to do. And these poor people had decided the only place they can go was Palestine. It seemed to be the only place where they might be accepted, even though it was a 2,000 or more mile journey on foot. And he actually helped them by making sure they had food, water, and so on, and knew where they were going, and helped them understand a place where they could go, other camps they could go to on the way to get more food or whatever. So that's the story of that. It stayed a camp for many years after liberation. I think it was closed down in 1950, something like that.
Yeah.
But while just after going back to now, after liberation, there was this clothes store because the clothes had been taken from requisition from clothes shops and families all around, so that these poor prisoners had something to wear rather than those horrible pajamas, which had all been burnt anyway. Yeah. And it's just a funny little thing. This store where all the clothes, it was called Harrods. It was nicknamed Harrods. I think that's just a lovely story. The other story is about the lipstick.
The lipstick was a fabulous, but when I saw the lipstick, I knew that would be something that women would want.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But he didn't. Dad had no idea. He thought it was, who's going to want that? It was ridiculous. Why are people sending lipstick?
That was people all over the world sending little gift packs, basically, for them, food and clothing and everything, wasn't it? And they were sending lipsticks as well. And your dad, of course, being a typical man, and certainly a man in the 40s would have probably thought, what would the women want with that? But of course, it was a sense of humanity that they had been deprived of. I mean, many of them used to use their blood, cut their fingers to try and give themselves a sense of rouge on their faces.
God, terrible.
Because if they looked healthy, they had a better chance of surviving. Do you know? So never underestimate the power of makeup to a woman.
Exactly. So that Dad learned that to his surprise, the importance of lipstick. And then the other thing is that things had got so good at the rehabilitation camp, transit camp, displaced persons camp, whatever you want to call it. There was a huge auditorium for 800 people to watch shows, movies, or whatever. And there was activities and sport, plays. One newspaper described it as a holiday camp now.
But in a sense, wasn't it the British trying to turn a place of horror, unspeakable horror,
yes,
into a place that people could look back in years and think, well, I lived through unimaginable horror for so many years, but towards the end, I can remember good things that happened there, thanks to what, you know, in a sense, it was rehabilitating people, preparing them for the outside world.
What was a rehabilitation camp? That's one of its ways.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people must have felt in some way institutionalized. They were afraid to move on because they knew, or move back to what they had left, their homes, because one, they didn't know whether they were welcomed. Two, they didn't know if their homes existed. And three, many of them probably thought, why should we be going back to a place that rejected us?
Yeah, exactly. So they just stayed there until they had a plan, for years in some cases.
And then Israel welcomed its open arms to its own.
Yes, and I wonder how many people, the forefathers, as it were, of the present population, great grandparents and so on, knew Dad or had something to do with Dad before they left the camp.
Well, I interviewed a Dr. Leah Ganor, and she's from Israel, and she did her PhD on the amount of survivors from the Holocaust who actually became members of the IDF, which was compulsory, anyone that lived there. And then she did a postdoctoral research on those within the ranks of the IDF who actually went on to become pilots in the Israeli Air Force. And out of the 320 pilots that were in the Israeli Air Force, 150 of them were Holocaust survivors. Not a remarkable.
Yeah, there you go.
And they wanted to fly for a country that had actually welcomed them as their, welcomed their own people, which is very heartwarming for people who were rejected all over the world, all over Europe, and it's just remarkable. But his life then from there, when he came back to England, safe to say his life was never the same again. He might have, had a career, but that's always in your head. That can't ever leave you. No. Maybe his book, in some respects, was cathartic.
Well, we don't know what he would have been like if he hadn't experienced Belsen. This is the thing. I wonder how his character would have been like.
He'd have probably been an academic, earning a lot of money.
I mean, his personality, would he have been emotionally different? We'll never know, of course. But it must have affected him negatively. But he managed to control it so well. And as I said, was very successful in life afterwards, despite the trauma of it all. But there's one more story I want to tell you that's really funny. It's about food, and he was stationed. We're near the camp somewhere with his staff and so on. And right next door was a farm. A German farmer ran it, and the Germans are no longer at this point allowed to have guns. Just straight after the war had been won. But Dad was allowed to have a gun. And because they were fed up with the rations and they were in need of a good meal, he had a deal with the farmer, who was an excellent stalker. And he would, secretly and quietly with Dad, stalk a deer or a wild boar.
Oh, I thought you meant a stalker. The present day stalker.
Oh, okay, no. The farming sense, or hunting sense. And then he'd shoot it and put it in the back of the truck, take it to the farmhouse where the farmer's wife would prepare it into a huge banquet. And then a week later, him and his troops and his family and everything would go and have a great meal with lots of booze and cigarettes. It was a great story.
But you know, when you were growing up, when you, as a child, I mean, I've spoken to many children of Holocaust survivors, and they all vary in their experiences with their parents. I mean, if you look at the book Mouse by Art Spiegelman, he never had a good relationship with his dad, Vladek, or his mother committed suicide after when he was young because she could never get over Auschwitz. And could never get over the fact that her older son had died in Auschwitz. And so his dad remarried, and the dad and his second wife could never get on. And he couldn't get on with his dad because they were constant reminders. Certainly him and his second wife were, you'd imagine that having that in common would bond them. But in actual fact, it broke them because they were constant reminders to each other of what they had suffered and what they had lost. Now, I have spoken to others who had great relationships with their parents and knew that their parents, or felt their parents, had married, not out of necessarily love, but to have a family, to gain something back that they had lost, maybe 13 of their members of their family. Suddenly they meet somebody, and many of them made friends and became looked on other Holocaust survivors in their parents' lives as family members, that they didn't have aunts or uncles because they died.
Yes.
But these new Holocaust survivor friends were all their aunts and uncles. And so there's so many, some people spoke about it, others didn't. Your dad didn't speak about it.
No, I mean, I think I got off very lightly. I mean, he didn't seem to be so badly affected at all compared to lots of other horror stories of survivors or liberators. And we had a relatively normal family life. So how lucky is that? That he managed to just not be affected or refuse to be affected by it. I think the first few years, Mum says that it was a taboo subject. She wasn't allowed to mention the war. If anything came on TV, she turned it off, or the radio. It was not allowed to be discussed. But then he just kind of grew out of it or something, and then started talking about it a lot. And then he gave lectures, appeared in documentaries, and wrote the book. So, and so to finish the story, afterwards, he, after helping everyone escape to Palestine, he was transferred to a military government detachment in Schleswig-Holstein, which is just south of Denmark, where he supervised German civilian authorities like the police, transport, and medical, and so on, to keep it all running properly. And a lot of them were also helping the displaced persons camps of the former, it wasn't only Belsen, there were loads of them all over the place, and they were sort of helping provide resources to help these people get well and go back home. And then in September 1945, he testified in the Belsen trials.
That must have been something, quite an experience to it's almost like testifying at the Nuremberg.
Yes, it was the first war crime trials of World War II, earlier than Nuremberg. And his testimony was that there was loads of food in the barracks just up the road that was unused. And if the Germans had wanted to, they could easily have got the water going, because the British did it very quickly. So
they were the Panda barracks, weren't they? The Pandas.
That's right, tank, yeah.
Panda tank, yeah.
But the thing is, the British got the water going very quickly using the fire brigade. So could the Germans, if they'd wanted to, but they didn't, and let everyone die.
Of any nation, one would think that the Germans, who would have been so highly experienced in engineering and that, could surely have got the water working if they wanted to.
Yeah, they obviously didn't, and that was what he testified. Also, the food, the fact that it was full of food and it wasn't used to feed all the starving people. So that ended up not only Dad's testimony, but all the rest of the evidence, that it was 43 guards plus Kramer was on trial, and 10 in total were hanged as a result of the trials.
Kramer was hanged publicly, wasn't he?
Well, within
the camp.
Well, the famous, I've forgotten his name now, the famous...
Pierpoint?
No, that's right, yeah. And so that's the end
of
the story.
On a personal level, how must Albert Pierpoint have felt going through life knowing that he was whether you agree that I don't agree with the death penalty in crimes. You know, I look at America and I think, you know, certain states and they kill people, and you think, well, if murder is murder, these people should be locked up for the rest of their lives in solitary confinement with bread and water. But you know, but how must Albert Pierpoint have felt, because nobody seems to know really what happened to him or where he's buried or anything, because he had some awful job.
Yeah, well, that's a whole big subject in itself, of course. And from what I read, I think he was quite proud of it, that he was
the
nation rid the world of these evil people.
Oh yeah, I mean it actually juggles with me, because I say I'm anti-death penalty, but then I think for crimes like this, you know, these people don't deserve to live.
Well, yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
But then you think, you know, it's too quick a death for what they've done.
Well, there's that too.
And then you start questioning your own humanity, that you would say something like that.
Well, yeah.
You know, but so he went on and had a happy life.
Oh yeah. Then now it's post-war, completely his post-war life. Well, I'll just tell you a quick overview of it, because that's not really the topic we're discussing. But just so you know, to round off the character, so he just left the war, just left the army, and he didn't know what to do with himself. He was a bit sad about it, really, because he missed Cambridge.
A clothes factory.
Well, he missed Cambridge, and he therefore wasn't trained to do anything that was of use to any kind of company or anything.
Yeah.
And he didn't know what to do with himself. So he went to a club, and he was just having a drink, and this guy next to him heard his sort of sob story, and he said, "Well, I'm looking for managers," and that was his career, just like that. He got the job just like that, from a chap called Leslie Burker, who started the company Burkertex. And it was in London at the time, and then it moved to Plymouth, which is why I was born in Plymouth. And it was huge. It was the UK's largest clothing factory at the time. And Dad was the general manager, just because he met this guy at the bar saying he doesn't know what to do with his life. Isn't that incredible? And ended up working in clothing, fashion, high fashion, until the 70s.
And he started his own label, didn't he?
That's right, yeah. And then moved to Spain, retired in 1977. And then he went and lived on the World, this beautiful ship.
I know. He spent a few years on a beautiful on a ship.
Yeah, the world's largest privately owned yacht. Everybody owns their own apartment in it.
Oh!
It's dry dock now, I think, or it's just not going anywhere because of COVID. But yeah, beautiful place. I went aboard many times. And he died in 2016. He published his book in 2015, as I said.
Died in 2016. But
yeah,
when you look at the photographs of him with his book, you don't think that he's near to death. Do you know? He looked so healthy.
Oh yeah, well, he had a dodgy heart. He had a pacemaker.
Okay.
So he was fine, but it packed up at the last minute, and so it was very quick. Well, yeah, anyway, it's really, really sad.
Well, John, you know, you've been an absolute joy to talk to today, and you know, a privilege really to get a completely different side. One always hears about from the victim's perspective, and you wonder who, you know, there are so many victims from an event like this, and you know, war makes victims out of a lot of people, not just the people who are actually suffering, but the people who actually have to witness it, and then the families afterwards who have to live with the people who have suffered. So you become the victims.
That's right.
And it's just a never-ending cycle. And you know, you can talk about it and think that in some way it's cathartic or it's rehabilitative, but you know, at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to make anything good out of this is that it doesn't happen again.
And the story is told.
And that the story is absolutely forever told. That's why I think I do these interviews. I'm hoping to do a postdoctoral research on Hubert Butler, who was he was considered the Irish George Orwell.
Ah, okay.
And very little is known about him. There's one PhD that was done under the supervision of Professor Roy Foster in Cambridge, or in Oxford, I should say, and that's it. I mean, apart from his own books, but he had a falling out with the Catholic Church in Ireland because of his antipathy towards the Catholic Church's involvement with Eastern Bloc and Nazis coming into this country.
That's another story.
So he ended up moving to Austria. He went to Czechoslovakia. He went to a few countries, and then he went to Austria and saved the lives of Jews, and smuggled them into Ireland, and then on to the Americas. So I've applied for postdoc to do that.
Fantastic.
So I fingers crossed I get it, but I think it's important that the story is told through. That's why I've been doing the videos.
Yeah, you're providing a wonderful service through this. Be my guest.
I hope so, because I mean, we can read about it, and it's wonderful reading about it. But I suppose the proposal I've put in is that I write a book, and that I do a 30-minute radio documentary and a series of drama, a series of educational tools for, and then later on I'd hope to run a conference, and because of my drama background, it could turn into a play. There's so much potential for it for his story and the story of the victims to get to a more broader audience, because not everyone will read a book. Not everyone will have the time to sit down and read it, but they might go to a play.
Absolutely.
Or they might listen to a short 30-minute documentary.
Yeah. So keep going. You're doing a wonderful job.
Oh, I hope so.
And if I could just give Dad the last word, in that the reason that he wanted to write the book, it was to hope that by hearing about his story, it prevents more atrocities, another Holocaust, and also to counteract Holocaust deniers, because he knows it really did happen, because he saw it with his own eyes. And I'm just keeping his name alive and his story alive for that purpose.
John, thank you very much indeed. Shindera Leshanclor, that is the end of the show for today. Until the same time, or until the next show. Good day, Slán.
Thank you for having me.
John.